Tonight on Newshour, Brussels under fire. A formal motion of no confidence has been lodged against the European Commission, led of course by Ursula von der Leyen, by the fast-rising Patriots for Europe group. The bloc's third largest group says the Commission has eroded Europe's strategic autonomy by pushing through unapproved trade deals, including what it calls a capitulation to Washington. Well, 85 MEPs have now signed the motion, comfortably above the threshold to trigger an official vote, a sign of just how deep the discontent runs within the European Parliament. At the heart of their anger lies not only the EU-US trade pact, but also a growing belief that Brussels is out of touch with the continent's economic reality. Europe's industries are stagnating, investors are fleeing, and yet the Commission's answer appears to be, well, more tariffs. Even as the EU contemplates 50% duties on imported steel, businesses say they're being buried under regulation and red tape. Hardly the recipe for recovery. With faith in the EU's leadership faltering and populists gaining momentum, the question is no longer whether von der Leyen can survive this vote, but whether Brussels can survive itself. Let's take a look at this in more detail.
The latest turmoil in Brussels is more than just political theatre. It's a reflection of deep fractures over Europe's direction. At the centre of the storm is the Patriots for Europe, a nationalist bloc that has quickly become a formidable force within the European Parliament. Their motion of no confidence isn't simply about Ursula von der Leyen, it's about a broader rebellion against how the European Commission wields power. The group accuses the Commission of acting without democratic oversight, advancing major trade deals before national parliaments have had their say. In their words, the EU has traded transparency for expediency. It's a message resonating with disillusioned voters who see Brussels as distant, bureaucratic and unaccountable. Critics point to recent trade agreements, especially the ones struck with Washington, as proof of misplaced priorities. They argue that instead of shoring up Europe's manufacturing and supply chains, Brussels has ceded leverage to the US and exposed European producers to unfair competition. The timing could hardly be worse. The bloc's economy is losing momentum, energy prices remain volatile, industrial output is slipping, and investor confidence is waning. Yet, the Commission continues to double down on tariffs, with plans for a 50% duty on imported steel. A move economists warn could backfire by driving up cost and stifling growth. For von der Leyen, the challenge is existential. Surviving the no-confidence vote would not silence critics who see her Commission as a symbol of overreach. For the EU, it's a moment of reckoning, whether to reform from within or face a rising populist tide that promises to reclaim power from Brussels. Either way, Europe's unity and its economic credibility now hang in the balance.
OK, let's cross over now to our correspondent Ross Cullen, who's in the region, and get the latest from him. Ross.
Well, Guy, this is the second term for Ursula von der Leyen as President of the European Commission, but it certainly seems that this time around things are getting more difficult in terms of her relationship with the European Parliament. On Monday, she was speaking here in France, in the city of Strasbourg, addressing European lawmakers and trying to allay their concerns over these upcoming no-confidence motions. She did try to paint herself as a picture of stability, as a safe pair of hands, saying that the world is in a more precarious and perilous state than it has ever been. She did also, however, recognise some of the concerns that European lawmakers do have, genuine concern, she said, about Ukraine, Gaza, China, the free trade deal that the European Commission signed with the United States, also more personal criticism of her own leadership style. Now, these no confidence votes will take place later in the week, and it is extremely unlikely that she will lose, because the centre-left, the centre-right and the centre overall have said that they will be pledging their support. Hundreds of members of the European Parliament going to side with her. For now, we do know that one centrist lawmaker saying that they were criticising the no-confidence motions, one which has been brought by the far left, one which has been brought by the far right, saying that there are more pressing issues for the European Parliament to deal with. However, there was one centre-left lawmaker who said that while they were going to support Ursula von der Leyen for now, that support was not a blank cheque. They would only continue to back her if she keeps her promises. These no-confidence motions, while they are likely to fail, do show that there is growing concern in the European Parliament, specifically over Ursula von der Leyen's governance style and her leadership style and the direction of travel when it comes to policy making in the European Commission.
Let's break this down further now. My guest tonight is an EU policy expert, Vlad Altinu, joining from Brussels. Thank you very much, Vlad, for joining us. Do you think the President of the European Commission might have a blind spot? The reason I ask this, Vlad, is I remember standing there in Davos when she announced her fight back against economic stagnation. She specified problems and solutions to deliver this fast action. But when you look at some of those problems, one problem was to reduce red tape. Her proposed solution, create a new set of rules for sustainable finance and due diligence. Another problem, how to lower the barriers within the single market. Her solution, new laws, new rules, standardized approaches for SMEs across the continent. I mean, I could go on, but the answer always seems to be more, doesn't it? More rules, more standardization, more Europe, even when that seems to be part of the problem.
Yes, I do agree with you, Guy, that actually that was part of the problem. Always more regulations, always more red tape. But at the same time, if we look at the last 6 months, the Commission has tried to do less. So they tried to introduce the so-called omnibus, so actually the simplification of measures compared to the previous Commission. The trouble here is that the previous Commission and the current Commission as a leadership is similar. So Ursula von der Leyen is actually following herself. So the previous Commission introduced many rules. They have not allowed enough time to businesses to adapt to the new rules. And now they're basically withdrawing part of those rules, or at least getting different timelines for the Commission to basically Commission services to be able to follow and for the businesses to be able to follow. And I think if we look at all that, it's a bit confusing. It's a bit confusing for businesses. It's a bit confusing for citizens as well. You created a number of rules, and now you withdraw from part of the rules, while you enforce even more some of the rules. So on the omnibuses, you withdraw on, for instance, such rules as digital, artificial intelligence, applications of those, applications of energy standards, energy consumption targets. So you go on some of the rules lower, but then on some of the other rules, such as trade measures, for instance, you go higher. So it's a bit confusing, really, what she's trying to do. And probably that's why she's facing in the parliament opposition. And the opposition that she should worry about is not about the groups, be it far left or far right. So be it the Patriots for Europe or GUE, NGL, etc., who are at the end of the day minimal. They will never be able to topple her down. It's a simple question of mathematics of votes. She should be worried about opposition from the mainstream groups, from the EPP and SD. Because if opposition grows there is a real chance that she would be toppled down. And that would be, to say the least, very problematic for the European Union at the current point in time.
Yeah, and what a time it is to face challenges. Already multiple crises confronting Europe, energy shocks, security threats. We've spoken about the economy. I suppose moving away from the Brussels bashing, I suppose there is an argument that says that now is the time for, I guess, more continuity, that Brussels in a sense could be perceived as being more important now than ever?
Absolutely. I mean, if you look at at three things, I think that you will see immediately why Brussels will be a better answer than any national answer. The first one is the security crisis. It is very difficult to imagine that the member states alone will be able to create a security framework in which they will be able to defend themselves. Just think about Estonia, Lithuania, Lithuania, small member states of the EU, small members of NATO, left alone. That would be simply not thinkable. The second part of that, where Brussels will be better than a member state as a response, is basically the economic world in which we live today, which is based on a very clearly shifting sense and shifting economic power very, very fast. 20 years ago, for instance, China was not far, was definitely not number one in the world in terms of many economic outputs, but clearly it was a developing economy. Nowadays, it's no longer a developing economy. The United States, 20 years ago, on the other hand, was actually a friend hand in hand with the European Union in terms of actually developing economic policies. And nowadays, you see a United States which seems to drift apart from the European Union, and clearly, by the voice of its president, is basically against the European project altogether. So you have a second element there. And the third element, which is there, which is very interesting, is that the shifting mood in the European Union member states in terms of policy analysis and policy results, outputs, so votes, elections, people being elected in the European Union, is also extremely interesting. You have some member states which go towards right, some member states, and that is clearly, for instance, the case, for instance, for Czech Republic, last but probably not least, you have the very tense political situation in France, which is the second economy of the EU bloc. And then you have countries drifting towards left. Not much is left in the center. So without a proper center, it's very, very difficult to reach agreements across the blocs, which are standing agreements and which will move together. Member states alone will find it much more difficult to move into any direction, actually, into such a political situation. Why? Because, again, some are to the right, some are to the left. Those right and left are no longer part of the mainstream, so they are not discussing too much. They're actually, look at the French situation, they're accusing each other of everything possible. So with that in mind, if the answer is not more Europe, but a better Europe, a more agile, a simplified, a pragmatic Europe, if the answer is not that, then I'm wondering what the answer could be.
Yeah, very important question. Let's just zone in a little bit, Vlad, on the specifics of what has been alleged. How serious are these accusations, do you think, that von der Leyen's commission bypassed national parliaments when approving trade deals?
Look, I think coming from that particular group, it's probably an allegation more than anything. So I think that if she would have worn a blue suit, they would have said, why don't you wear today a red suit? They needed to find a reason why to go with a motion, very, very honestly. Now, was the commission stepping above its powers? Not really. I mean, technically speaking, trade is a power of the union. It's not a power of the member state. They delegated that by the treaties, so the commission has quite a lot of discretion in deciding that. Of course, in close cooperation with the council, which is the representative of the member states. In the council formation for that particular trade deals, heads of states and governments do sit. So it's basically a discussion, a decision, a common joint option that basically they take. The commission pursues that line. I think that's very clear, and I think there is little argument to be made. Now, in terms of emergency, well, many people, citizens, businesses in Europe were actually very worried about the tendency from the United States to impose new tariffs, and they were wondering what is the capacity of the Union to actually respond to that in a fast enough timing not to penalize the European Union. So this is basically a negotiation, and the rule in negotiations is that you need to respond timely to avoid an imposition that will be detrimental to you. So I think at the end of the day, the speed at which they responded was appropriate to the speed of the other parties making decisions. The way in which they responded, this is always a subject of discussion. Arguably, it would have been made better, yes, but at the same time, those are high-stake negotiations, and one needs to always keep in mind that the trade is only part of the discussion, not the end of the discussion. So, for instance, in this case, trade discussions with the United States are in parallel with defense discussion in the United States, where the United States are actually the main partner within NATO and the key provider for the European Union in terms of defense and security.
And Vlad, you mentioned that it could have gone better there. I suppose some critics would describe that as somewhat of an understatement. Do you think the EU-US trade agreement that's been described by some as a capitulation, do you think it exposes a widening imbalance in Europe's transatlantic relationship?
Yeah, I think if you look at the data shows a deficit and a surplus in the if you look services versus goods. So in the goods, the EU has a surplus. In the services, and especially digital services, the EU has a clear deficit. President Trump's idea there was basically not to equalize the two, but basically to maximize the benefit of the United States compared to the EU. And again, he is the president of the United States. Nothing shocking there. The reaction from the European Union was maintaining a communication line and hitting, but not hitting hard enough for President Trump to become upset. And President Trump, as we know, can become upset extremely easily and extremely fast. So they had a marge de maneuver, which was quite limited there. Yes, arguably it could have been made better in the way that the European Union still has the utmost in the trade part on goods, and goods can actually affect the US market in a very severe way. I mean, tariffs on goods can higher inflation in the US by a few digits very, very fast. So no US president, I think, over the short to medium term wants to face high inflation, because high inflation comes at significant political costs, especially with midterm elections. Digital services, on the other hand, are actually, yes, we are in a digital economy, so they are actually essential, but at the same time, they are more difficult to tax and much easier to evade. And actually, the evasion system was the weak point of the EU in its negotiations, because the evasion system goes by using EU member states. So it's very difficult to tax those EU member states. And I think while everybody thinks of some, I could quote here the case of Ireland. So for sure, it's much more difficult to respect the internal rules of the EU and tax Ireland for the evasion of digital services.
Yeah, and Vlad, let's just talk about the difference now between the member states and the institutions themselves, because this motion of no confidence, it could be seen as symptomatic of a broader crisis of legitimacy within the EU institutions. Equally, though, it could be seen to some degree as convenient scapegoating from individual member states that themselves have enormous economic issues that they themselves have created.
Yeah, you are very right there. So actually, for instance, if we are looking at the debt levels of the EU economies and of the top EU economies, you have a good position of Germany, who is actually indebting itself more, especially for defense, but it has the margin to do so. Then you have, of course, France and Italy with growing debts well above 100% of the GDP, which are entering into very, very severe financial market zones.
And Vlad, sorry to interrupt, but just on that, on France, I mean, we covered this a lot on our show. How on earth does France now get itself out of this seemingly immovable stalemate situation?
It will be a very, very difficult, very, very difficult way for France. There are a number of solutions, but none of them are real solutions. So, of course, President Macron could dissolve the parliament yet again. The most probable result of that will be a parliament which will be even more hangout, with more far right gaining probably in the next parliament. Also because the whole dispute exploded the center and the center agreement. The French system, electoral system, works that in a way that you basically go and vote twice, and the second time you vote in between the two front runners. In the previous election, there was an agreement within the central bloc to always ally against far right. Nowadays, because of the clear problems within the bloc, the central bloc, that will most probably not be the case, which means that probably the far right will gain more seats. That is a hang solution. So in such a solution, the president will have probably very little chance but to appoint a prime minister from the far right, which he absolutely doesn't want to do, clearly. Now, if he doesn't want to do that, the only other choice is that for him to leave, for him to resign. And the resignation at this point in time will be very dangerous indeed, because all the polls indicate that in a presidential race, if the presidential race will happen very fast, like in the next 3 months, the far right is very likely to win that race. And that will be a very, very worrying sign for Europe. Now, there are a number of far-right regimes in Europe. So you look at Prime Minister Viktor Orban of Hungary, you look at Slovakia. Yes, there are a few far-right regimes. There are some who are qualified as far-right, even if arguably they are more right-center. So that is President Meloni. She's president of the Council of Ministers. She's in de facto Prime Minister of Italy, but she's a president still. Now, in her case, very clearly, that is more towards the center. It's center-right, but she's there. However, nobody tested in France a solution with far-right there, and nobody can be sure of what that will mean for Europe. To what extent France with a president, which is far-right, because the president does represent by the constitution the French Republic within the European institutions, within the Council. Nobody tested that hypothesis and see to what extent such a France would be a partner rather than a blocking point within an European.
Okay, Vlad, let's just bring this back finally to the President of the Commission herself. If von der Leyen does survive this challenge, what's it going to take to rebuild trust among member states and citizens for that matter, who sincerely feel that Brussels has lost touch and overreached?
It is a very good question. I think she needs to go probably in 3 stages. First of all, avoid that distrust in the parliament goes towards the center of the parliament. Because how she can fall by emotion in the parliament. This is the way. And she needs to avoid at all costs that is happening again. Now, this whole motions, because now we have 3. We had 1 of the ECR, or part of the ECR. We now have 2. We have 1 of the Patriots and 1 of the far left. So at the end of the day, we had 3 motions, or 2.5 motions against her. The first thing is to calm down the things in the parliament. The second thing is to really work with the council in a way in which she can, in a much more direct way, send her messages directly to the citizens. So go as, to the main level of democracy, the grassroots level. If she doesn't do that, she basically exposes herself quite a lot. And she exposes herself quite a lot. Why? Because at the end of the day, those citizens are going to vote. And they are very sensitive to the national rhetoric. And the national rhetoric in the European Union member states quite often is against the Union. Why? Because it's a very easy way to actually blame somebody. So you can it's a much more easy game to blame the European Union than to start blaming nationally what has happened wrong. So if she's not going herself and bridging herself to the European citizen, she risks losing that connection, and she risks allowing national politics to stay in the way and to come in the way. And that is not a good thing. Definitely not midterm, and for sure no long term. So basically, if she wants to control the game, she needs to be much more present in the local debate, not just in Brussels, but in the local debate in the member states.
Very, very interesting indeed. The blame game alive and well across the EU. Vlad, thank you so much for your analysis. We really do appreciate. Thank you.
Thank you.
As Europe then braces for a decisive vote, the future of Ursula von der Leyen's Commission and perhaps the credibility of Brussels itself, well, that hangs in the balance. The coming weeks will reveal whether this is a passing storm or the start of a political realignment that reshapes the Union's centre of gravity. Well, that is all for this edition of Newshour from all of us here at A News. Thanks for being with us.